What is going on, guys? Welcome to lesson 5 of my full course program. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite things, conditionals. Conditionals are awesome because we can run certain parts of our code only if certain conditions are met. For example, if the user is logged in to their Facebook program, then give them access to their messages and notifications. But if the user is not logged in, then we should not allow them to see anyone's messages or anyone's notifications. Make sure you watch the entire video because towards the end, I'm going to show you how to build your first little game in Python just by using conditionals. So that's enough introduction. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's create our very first program with conditions. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to create a program that will check for the user's age. If they are at least 16 years old, then let's have our program print you are old enough to drive. If they are less than 16, then it should print something else, such as you are too young to drive. I want you to create a variable called age, and we're going to set it to 10. Now before, we could just print whatever we wanted here. You are old enough to drive. But if I hit run, it's going to say you're old enough to drive, but guess what? The user's age is 10 years old right now, so I don't want this to run like that. So I only want this to run if age is greater than 16. I'm gonna have this colon here. This colon means then. So if this is true, if age is greater than 16, then do the following. Right here, I'm going to have some indentation. Indentation means spacing. If I just hit my tab key, you can see that this is actually part of the block of code of this if statement. So if this is true, it will run this. So if I hit run, look, nothing happens. That's because this was not true, so it skipped everything that was inside of this if statement. If I don't have that indentation there, you can see that there is an error. And so this says indentation error, expected an indentation block, meaning there should be something inside of here, but there's not. If you'd like me to make a separate video about just indentation and why we have it, how it works, then please drop a like. And if I get 100 likes, then I will create a video for that. Now let's change age to something above 16. I'm gonna say 20. If I hit run, you can see it says you are old enough to drive. So that is working nicely. But I don't want this to print nothing if my age is less than 16. So right now it does that. So this is where our else comes in. Else, colon, print you are too young to drive. So now if I hit run, well, this saw is age greater than 16? No. So it skips this and it runs your else. Now it says you're too young to drive. But if this was true, it says you're old enough to drive, and then it skips your else. So this is really effective because we can check for anything that we want, and then we can have it run however we want depending on the situation. Real quick, I want to test 16, and if I hit run, what do you think it would say? A lot of people will say you are old enough to drive. If I hit run now, it says I'm too young to drive. Let's look at the code and see why it says that. So it says if age is greater than 16, well, is 16 greater than 16? No. So we want to do greater than or equal to. So if I say greater than or equal to, now it says you're old enough to drive. So this equal sign has to be on the right side of this operator, the greater than sign. So that will now include that 16 inside of its range. Now I'm gonna make up a rule that you can be too old to drive. And if you're too old to drive, it will print you are too old to drive. So I'm gonna have it check if age is greater than or equal 120, then print you are too old to drive. If I change my age to 130, what do you think it's gonna say? If I hit run, it says you are old enough to drive, but it also says you're too old to drive. Now that's not the correct behavior. No, there is no red error like we are always afraid of, but it says two things which are really confusing. This is giving the user mixed messages. I don't want it to say you're old enough to drive, so go ahead, but also don't want it to also say you're too old, so don't drive. So the reason that this is printing two statements is because it checked is age greater or equal to 16? Yes. So printed you're old enough to drive. But then it also checked this if statement and said is age greater than or equal to 120? Also yes, you're too old to drive. So that's why I said two of them. Now remember when I said if if that is true, it will skip your else. Remember that? So there's something that we can use called elif. This combines if and else. So if something is true above it, it will be skipped and not even be ran. For example, I'm going to put else and if together. In other languages, it's this, else if, but in Python, it's elif. So let's see what happens when I run that. Now, it's running just one. Is age greater than or equal to 16? Yes. So it ran, you are old enough to drive, but then it skips the elif and the else and doesn't even check them. This is a great practice because this makes your programs faster. If you're trying to create video games, then this is a good practice because you want your video game to run as fast and as smoothly as possible. Now, us writing such a small program, you probably won't be able to tell the speed right now, but this will make it fast. Obviously, this is checking the wrong thing, and it's because it's checking to see if it's greater than 16 first. So that's why it says you are old enough to drive so far. So let's just change the order. I'm gonna highlight this, and I'm gonna do a cool little shortcut where I can move this entire snippet of code up above. If you are on Mac, you can hold down the Option key and then your arrow keys. And now I can move this block of code up and down. So I'm gonna put this as my first thing. If you're on Windows, it will be the Alt key. Hold down the Alt key and use your arrows. When I hit run, it's gonna give me an error because I cannot have an elif first. When you're doing conditionals, you must have an if statement first. So I'm gonna change this to if, and because I want this to be skipped now, if anything above it is true, I'm gonna call this elif. Let's see what happens now when I run 130. You're too old to drive. Let's test between 16 and 120. So now if I say 18, you're old enough to drive, which is correct. And let me just test one more time, anything below that, like 13. And now it says you are too young to drive. So congratulations if you went through that. That is a very basic conditional. Now, as promised, I want to show you guys how to create your first little game in Python. We're going to create a dice game that, depending on the role of the user, it's going to print something else. I'm just gonna call this game dice. And we are going to assume that we were just using a regular die that has just the standard 6 size to it. So I'm just gonna say 1 for right now. I am gonna test 1 through 6, and depending on the role, I want my program to say something else, a different phrase, such as if the user rolls a 1, I want it to print snake eyes. I've been getting some followers in other sources that ask me, why don't we just use a random generator to produce a random number between 1 and 6? Well, we will at the end of the program. The reason why that we are hard coding a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 now is because I want to test each one. If I wanted to test to see if 1 actually prints snake eyes, I might have to click the run button about 30 times to even roll a 1, just to make sure it works. So to save a lot of time, I'm going to hard code those values in and then have it be random later. So I'm gonna say if dice is double equals to 1, I'll explain double equals in just a sec, print snake eyes. So if I hit run, there's snake eyes. So single equals will store the right side into the variable to the left side. 2 equal signs means the same as. So your condition is saying, is dice the same as 1? Yes. So it prints snake eyes. Now let's do this next one. I'm gonna use elif so that my program runs faster. Elif dice is double equals to 2, print doubles. So we're always gonna test each one, make sure it works. I want you to notice that I'm always checking my code. I'll write 1 to 3 lines of code and then I'll test it after those lines. And then I'll write another 1 to 3 lines of code and I'll test it and make sure it runs right, and then I'll keep going. Once I run something and I see that it throws an error, well, guess what? I know that my error is within those past couple lines of code that I just wrote, because everything else I've already tested, I know it runs right, so that is a very good practice to have. So I tested 2 and it works. If I'm ever going too fast, you can always use the speed control in YouTube and make sure that it is slowing this down if I am talking too fast. Elif dice is double equals to 3, print you rolled a 3. Elif dice is the same as 4, print you rolled a 4. And then this is the one that the player probably doesn't want to roll. So if the dice is rolled as a 5, it will say bankrupt. And notice I forgot to test 3, 4, and 5. So remember, the reason that we are doing this is to test each one. So let's make sure I test 3, make sure it works. It does. I'll test 4, it rolls a 4, and 5, bankrupt. Perfect. Now I want you to guess what we should do next. 6 is going to be our last one, so do I do elif or do I do else? Let's try one of them. If I do else, remember else doesn't have any condition checking after it. Print, you win. So if the user rolls a 6, it should say you win. If I do 6, you can see it does say you win, which is awesome. I don't want it to happen because of this else. The reason I don't want to do else for you win is because, well, what if the slot machine for some reason malfunctions and for some reason rolls a 7? That's not a valid roll. But if I hit run, it still says you win. I'll use some extremes. I'll test around the border, so 0 also says you win, but if I do like -19, it says you win. So most likely if the system does glitch out and rolls a number outside of 1 and 6, then we are in trouble. And the casino or whoever's running your program will probably be losing a lot of money. So just remember that else is considered a catch-all or catch-all other conditions, meaning if it's not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, then run your else. So I do want this to be an elif as well. Elif dice is specifically 6, then print you win. So now with the -19 doesn't print anything, but if it's specifically 6, it will say you win. Most of the time you will have an else at the end. So if there is some kind of glitch, maybe you can say error, or you can say invalid roll. So now if I do 7, it says invalid roll, or same with that 0. Same with -19 or any of the extremes. So it has to be specifically a 6 for you to win. Now let's get into the random number generator. There's an entire library called random. I can do a Google search and I can say random library in Python and it will take me to this documentation. You can do this with any library. And if I look through here, it will show me how to code lots of these functions. It'll tell me what these functions are and how to use them. Right here's the one I want to use, something called randint. So I'm going to come in here, and the random library is actually not installed on Python for you. We need to import it. I'm going to say import random, and that's it. This is the same thing as if I were taking a CD and putting it into my computer. Now my computer has access to information that's on that CD. Just by saying import random is doing the same thing. So I said I wanted that randint function, and I want it to do a random number between 1 and 6. But if I run this right now, it says that this randint is not defined, as you can see at the bottom of my error. The reason is because it's not in our current directory, but it is inside the random directory. So I need to say random.randint. Now you can see it turned purple, just like all my other functions are purple. Now it recognizes it as a valid function. So random is kind of like a folder. The dot is like opening that folder, and then I said which function I want to use inside the random library as listed inside of the documentation. Now if I hit run, it says you rolled a 3, bankrupt, you rolled a 4, and every time I hit run, it's giving me a different random number, and this is working great. So you can make this game however you like. You can create rules, you can make another program, you can make as many dice as you would like, but that is it for our lesson 5. Thank you so much for joining in. Please stay tuned in for lesson 6 coming out in just a few days. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any questions or any suggestions for my next tutorials. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in lesson 6. I will see you in lesson 6.